Can you hear me? Yes. So, perfect. So, welcome to our session. I've got AI on you, spotlight on artificial intelligence and freedom of expression. And welcome to those here in the room. And I will hand over to our moderator, Denise, online, and our speakers.
Thank you very much, Julia. And hello and good evening from Vienna, and good afternoon to everyone who made it to Uruguay for this year's World Press Freedom Day. Thank you all for joining our hybrid session. My name is Denise Wagner. I'm an advisor to the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, where I've been diving deep into this issue for several years now that we will be discussing today. And I'll be moderating our 1-hour discussion. And I'm very excited to introduce a fantastic panel today, as well as the Argentinian political cartoonist Bex, who will be illustrating our discussions today. And for those of you in Uruguay and hopefully also online, will have a chance to see his unique illustration at the end of our session today. But without further ado, I would like to start us off by welcoming the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, Ms. Teresa Ribeiro. She will set the scene today and introduce our session. So Ms. Ribeiro, the microphone is yours.
Thanks a lot, Denise, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear guests. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's session. I've got my eye on you, AI on you, spotlight on artificial intelligence and freedom of expression, today focused on the interlinkage between the safety of journalists, freedom of expression and opinion, and the impact of artificial intelligence. AI has increasingly become the main tools for shaping and arbitrating content online, including for censorship and content control. AI is used to decide what content is taken down, which content is prioritized, or to whom and when is disseminated. In short, to govern our online information spaces. The technologies that execute these decisions affecting political and public discourse are developed and deployed by a few powerful gatekeepers and are potentially biased and error-prone. Generally, AI-based tools are not necessarily designed for diversity, accuracy, or the public good. They are designed to maximize user engagement in order to increase advertising and thus profit. If it's undeniable that the way online information is curated and moderated has a direct and significant impact on media pluralism and democracy, there is no doubt that it impacts global peace, stability, and comprehensive security. And it becomes even more evident at times of crisis. Moreover, AI enables constant surveillance, analysis, and profiling, both for commercial and political aims. This puts journalists and other media actors at particular risk as they face a range of digital security threats, including illegal or arbitrary observation, online harassment, and targeted disinformation campaigns. The comprehensive security approach, which is the DNA of the OSCE, includes media freedom as one of its important pillars, thus recognizing that there is no security without media freedom. And there can be no media freedom with necessary safeguards for freedom of expression in the development and deployment of AI online. For this reason, this January, my office launched a policy manual with guidance to states on safeguarding freedom of expression in the use of artificial intelligence for content moderation and curation. This book is a product of our SAFE project and is a combination of over 2 years of research and contributions of more than 120 of the most renowned experts, scholars, and practitioners working in the field of media freedom, human rights, technology, and security. In the SAFE Policy Manual, we have focused on 4 key areas where the use of artificial intelligence can be perilous for media freedom and comprehensive security. First is the use of AI in content moderation, with a particular focus on dealing with illegal content and security threats online. Second, on moderating content that might be legal yet harmful, such as hate speech. Third, on the use of AI in content curation and how this impacts media pluralism. And the fourth is its nexus to targeted advertising and surveillance capitalism, which is particularly relevant for our conversation today. There are some overarching free speech safeguards for the use of AI in content governance and the most basic guidelines needed to preserve and foster the internet as a space for democratic participation and representation, for media freedom, and for security. These include that states should put human rights at the core of all regulatory frameworks. Initiatives should be evidence-based and built on inclusive processes. The key recommendations spell out in more detail principles of transparency, accountability, and public oversight. Today, we want to particularly focus on the use of AI for surveillance. This is closely linked to many areas of my work, and in particular, to the safety of journalists and diversity of sources. The policy manual provides several recommendations on how to address the use of AI for surveillance. It is closely linked to the business models and business practices built on surveillance-based targeted advertising. It is important, though, to also recognize that the surveillance environment of corporations, and particularly online platforms, can facilitate the surveillance by states. Data harvesting business models can, and unfortunately, are abused by states. Public authorities often relying on data mining from private companies access a variety of data provided by the private sector. In short, AI has enabled new possibilities of mass state surveillance, piggybacking on the data harvesting architecture of intermediary business models. Individuals' data, characteristics, and vulnerabilities are exploited for targeted advertising, but also for monitoring civilians. Unnecessary and disproportionate surveillance always undermines security online and hinders access to information and ideas. Inherently, surveillance creates a chilling effect on online expression of individuals, and it particularly threatens the rights of journalists and members of civil society. It leads to self-censorship for fear of being constantly surveyed. Let me be clear, constant and undifferentiated surveillance, be it for corporate or state aims, interferes with the absolute right to freedom of opinion and also with the right to seek, receive, and impart information of all kinds. We need to address the broader surveillance-based ecosystem to genuinely protect and promote freedom of opinion and expression in the digital age. And no doubt, we need to address the specific and targeted surveillance of journalists that undermines their safety and digital security, as well as the free flow of information and media pluralism. I'm delighted to have this discussion today with three excellent speakers and would like to welcome Vladan Joler, who chaired the content curation and surveillance work in our SAFE project, and will further explore the impact of the constant surveillance ecosystem online. Andrei Soldatov, who will link the issue of journalists under surveillance and digital siege to media freedom and also to secret services activities, in particular by Russian authorities. And Arzu Geybulay will explore impact of AI on the free flow of journalistic content online. I'm very much looking forward to the discussions, and I thank you very much, all of you, for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Ribeiro, also for speaking about the OSCE Policy Manual, the themes of which will be discussed by our panelists, all of whom also contributed to this publication. And thank you also for your very clear and powerful message. Indeed, there can be no security without media freedom, and there can be no media freedom without the necessary safeguards, as you have mentioned, for freedom of expression in the development and deployment of AI online. And with this year's World Press Freedom Day theme, Journalism Under Surveillance, UNESCO has put great emphasis on the role that these digital technologies are playing, both in terms of opportunities to journalism. And we really hope to unpack these throughout our session, breaking it down specifically into key impact areas. In other words, today we'll discuss the use of AI for curating online information spaces, how it's interlinked with this surveillance-based business models that you have already mentioned, and how all this influences the free flow of information and journalistic content, and ultimately the impact all this has on our rights to freedom of opinion and expression. And now I'd like to introduce our three additional speakers for today. First, Vladan Joler, an academic, researcher, and artist. Many of you may know him as co-founder of the renowned Share Foundation, or perhaps you visited his scientific artwork at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City or other exhibits around the world. We also have with us today Suzy Allegre, an international lawyer and author, and soon to be Deputy High Court Judge in the UK. Suzy has just launched her latest book, Freedom to Think, which explores how the powerful have always sought to influence how we think, and why our freedom of opinion is under particular threat today, like never before. And I really look forward to hearing more about that from you, Suzy. And last, but certainly not least, we have the inspiring journalist Arzu Geybulayeva. And Arzu writes with a special focus on digital authoritarianism and its implications on human rights and press freedom. And she's also a board member of Access Now and Global Voices. Thank you all for joining. And I should add, we did have Andrei Soldatov on the agenda, but unfortunately, minutes ago, he had to cancel due to an emergency personal conflict of calendar. So apologies on his behalf also that he wasn't able to join us today, but thank you all for joining. And Vladan, let me start with you. Many civil rights groups have been raising alarm for years, pointing to, Ms. Ribeiro, sorry, you would like
yes,
to...
just to my apologies, Suzy Allegre, for not mentioning you. I'm very, very sorry. Very, very sorry for that, but I didn't want the discussion to start without presenting you my apologies. I'm more than delighted to have you and to have your very, very knowledgeable contribution to our discussion. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And again, apologies.
Thank you,
I'm sorry,
Mr.
sorry, Denise, for...
No, it was a very valid intervention. So thank you very much. Going back to Vladan, I was mentioning that many citizens, civil rights organizations, and others have been raising alarm for a long time now, pointing to ongoing human rights violations resulting from opaque and automated decision-making, enforced through this surveillance-based business models of the most powerful online platforms, as we've also heard in the introduction by the representative. Can you perhaps explain a little bit about how such surveillance is impacting individuals and society at large? And from your perspective, what should be done or perhaps is being done to tackle these challenges?
Thank you a lot. It's really a pleasure to be in such a wonderful company. I think the maybe important part of your question, it's more like concern with this idea that we don't know. And really for the last 10 years, we were like trying to investigate. First, we started to investigate internet service providers and then go deeper, finding, I don't know, trackers or data centers. And then more and more we were like diving into investigating and understanding those places. I was like more and more realizing that it's, you know, it's a wall after wall. It's untransparency on untransparency. And this is, I think, one of the key problems that we have today. It's that we basically don't have any idea of what's really going on there. Because it's really, there's like so many different ways how those companies are basically guarding this information, like how those algorithms look like, what kind of data sets are being used for AI. And basically at the end, probably even them, I'm sure that they do not have a full picture of how this really gigantic algorithmic AI, whatever system it's functioning. And this is a big problem. And we try to from the position, because usually we as a small, you know, human being, user or organization, we try to create some kind of cartography of those places that is coming from like a different perspective, because usually cartographies and mapping are coming from position of power. And in our case, we try to find a way how to investigate and how to draw those like cartographies of those like really opaque spaces. And the thing is like, I think that one of the problem, it's like, even if they give us a chance to see all of those algorithms and to see all of those AI systems and to know all the data set, we will never be able to understand what are the consequences, because we have like hundreds and hundreds of those. For example, in case of Facebook or case of like any of those like big systems, we have like hundreds and hundreds of different algorithms that are like basically functioning together, and they shape what we see. They connect thing like this contact with another one. They are moderating our lives on many different levels. And basically they are not fine-tuned, as Teresa mentioned, they're not fine-tuned to create better societies. They are fine-tuned to create profit out of it. And this is the only thing what they do. So those are like big machines for creating profit. And then the another problem, it's like, okay, we can speak about two different types of like let's say surveillance there. We can speak about this, what Shoshana Zuboff will call surveillance capitalism. And we can speak also about this kind of traditional form of surveillance that we had, for example, here in Serbia, this case with that is called Smart City, together with Huawei, and we called it, so they installed like thousands of smart cameras with this like AI enabled systems and so on and so on. So basically I think it's both important like to understand both of those types of surveillance, because like the surveillance this basically this surveillance capitalism that is basically extracting our bodies and our behavior and our movement and creating out of it this kind of new gold that they are, you know, like promoting, like data, it's a new gold and stuff like this. This is new type of labor relation that we have, you know, like in which we are not even understanding that this is type of labor. And I think it's like really important to understand and try to rethink this kind of new relation between us and this kind of invisible systems that exist behind that. But also to try to understand, so there is this kind of invisible part of this, and this maybe a bit more visible part of this, that those systems are huge systems for censorship, huge system for moderation of everything we do. And one of the main problem as well, it's like, okay, the reason why maybe we cannot even escape from there, because we instead of like keeping this track of having this kind of wonderful possibility of having decentralized internet, whatever, at the end we finished with like a centralization of power. We finished with all of those like few big companies controlling everything. And those few big companies, they do not have any other way probably than to do this kind of automatization of moderation, automatization of this control. And this is the problem. I think there is no any kind of way that we can create any kind of automatized system of moderation that will be acceptable or ethical for everyone, because like this is not what statistics do. This is not what those algorithms do. This is not what AI. This is not how AI is functioning. So in a way, we have like a lot of conflicting situations there, and I'm really sorry that we somehow end up in this like really strange variation of scenarios. You know, that we came up from this kind of, you know, that what at the beginning was like potential on internet end up in this really strange situation of having this kind of like enormous like system for like surveillance that you know, like, so. But probably it's not, you know, there is still chance somehow to change that and to try to rethink like how we can maybe make some kind of, you know, use this potential in some better way. But it's really hard because like we, as I said at the beginning, we don't know. And it's really hard to investigate. And on the other side, such a great accumulation of power and wealth is like really hard to break in this moment. But I think there is still some chances. Denise told me that I should be positive, so that's the.
Thanks, Vladan, for ending on this wonderfully positive note that there is still a chance. At least we can hang on this thought. No, but in all seriousness, thank you. There's a lot of interesting things to unpack there in what you have said, and I would like to come back to a few points of that shortly. But before I do, I'd like to move on to Suzy Alegre. Suzy, you've extensively researched how these technologies have been harnessed to manipulate the mind. And we know especially that surveillance-based business models have driven this kind of distortion of our information environment in ways that are at odds with the right to freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, and also at odds, as the representative has indicated in her introduction, with pluralism, diversity, democratic processes, decision-making. Can you tell us a little bit more about why we should be particularly concerned for our right to freedom of opinion? How does that sort of connect all of these issues together?
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, to say thank you so much for fitting me in at last minute. And I'm not sure I got the positivity memo, but I'll try to end on a positive point. And it's really a pleasure to be here talking about such a key issue that affects our current circumstances, but will also affect all of our futures. So as you say, in my work, I've really focused on how AI and the online environment affects our inner lives, our rights to freedom of thought and freedom of opinion. And so maybe if I just start by talking a little bit more about what freedom of opinion is and how it fits within the ecosystem of freedom of expression. One of the key things in Article 19 in the ICCPR and in the UDHR that's often forgotten is that Article 19.1 states that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Article 19.2 then goes on to talk about freedom of expression and freedom of information. But what really stands out in relation to the freedom and the right to hold opinions without interference is that that part of the right has no qualification. It can never be limited, and there can never be any justification for limiting our right to hold opinions without interference. But what does that mean in practice? I mean, ultimately, our opinions, when we express them, are challenged. We need information in order to form our opinions. So looking a little bit about what the right to hold opinions without interference means. It includes the right to form and change our opinions. I mean, hopefully for most of us, we're not born with a fixed set of opinions that are never going to change throughout our lives. And really, freedom of the media, freedom of expression, freedom of information are crucial to our ability to enjoy that right to form, change, and hold opinions without interference. But to protect our inner lives, not our ability to tell everyone what we think, but rather our ability to keep our opinions private, to be able to hold that space inside ourselves and decide when and what we want to share about our opinions is absolutely crucial to what it means to be human. The first aspect of freedom of opinion then is that right to keep our opinions private while they stay inside our heads. The second aspect is the right not to have our opinions manipulated. That doesn't mean our opinions can never be influenced. And as a lawyer talking to people about press freedom, clearly influence is part of our daily bread. It's what we do as advocates for human rights. It's what we do as journalists. It's what we do as writers. It's what we do as lawyers. We need to be able to influence, but not manipulate the opinions of others. And finally, there's the right not to be penalized for our opinions alone. While if we express opinions that amount, for example, to prohibited hate speech, then we may find that we can be penalized for what we say. We can never be penalized purely for what's going on inside our heads. And crucially, the drafters of the ICCPR recognized that it's not just correct opinions about what we think that might lead to an interference with our right. It's also inferences about what we think. And if you think in a historical perspective, if a witch finder says that you are a witch, whether or not you yourself actually believe in witchcraft will not stop you being convicted and possibly burned at the stake as a witch. It's about inferences about what you think, not just actually getting it right. So going back to what Vladan was talking about, surveillance. Surveillance today is not just about what you do. It's about running all of the information and data that's gathered about you in the online and in the offline space, increasingly in smart cities with surveillance everywhere. It's about running all of this information through AI, through technology, to make inferences about what you think. It's not just about knowing what you do, it's about trying to understand or to interpret what you think. One of the things I think we ought to bear in mind when we think about how we go about getting information and expressing information, testing out ideas in the online space, is that in Orwell's seminal work, 1984, Winston Smith, his hero, lived in a world where his writing was done on a daily basis at work through speak-write machines, which were able to understand and analyze everything that we were saying or doing. And he lived in the perpetual surveillance from the telescreens. For him, the ultimate act of rebellion, which would lead to conviction for thought crime itself, was to start to write in a notebook with a pen away from the sight of the telescreens. That in itself, it didn't matter what he wrote. It was the pure act of stepping away from that surveillance, which was in itself thought crime. And I think that is something that we should bear in mind when we think about how we work and how we live in a state of constant surveillance. Looking then at the question of manipulation, how do we develop our opinions? We need information. For all of us today, information is accessed online. It's the main way we find our information. And none of us are immune to the potential of online manipulation. While manipulation through access to media is not something necessarily new, as I wrote about in my book, in the 19th century, the Great Moon Hoax happened when a US newspaper published supposed images of bearded blue unicorns dancing on the moon as evidence that people were already on the moon, to influence the community in what I suppose is an early evidence of disinformation. What we see today is that this kind of information can go viral and often will go viral. The more outrageous or outlandish or the more emotive it is, the more likely it is to spread like wildfire online. Combined with knowledge and algorithms understanding how we think, how we feel, and how our emotions might best be orchestrated, that means these kind of viral information can spread in a very personalized way. Facebook conducted experiments that showed that by tweaking news feeds, it could affect the way people feel. So it's not just a question of fake news or disinformation or misinformation. It's also just about the way our news is curated and how that makes us feel. When you consider the power of the online information ecosystem, we also have to think about governance models and the dangers of having the power to manage our information flows in the hands of one individual or even a small number of individuals. Surveillance capitalism is based on the idea that we can know what every individual thinks and use that profiling to change it. Journalism and free press is key to thought leadership in our world, both online and offline. And so one of the key things, I think, when thinking about press freedom today is how do we protect journalists' abilities to form and hold opinions out of the sight of surveillance? And how do journalists and media organizations ensure that the way that they are able to operate in this new environment respects that right for others? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susie. There's also a lot of really interesting points you've made, particularly like the reference to 1984. And I'd like to come back to that and imagine, or not even so much imagine, but perhaps even envision that this can be a future reality and what needs to be done to sort of prevent that. But before we go into a philosophical debate about that, I'd like to move on to Arzu. We've heard about surveillance, and we've heard about the impact on freedom of opinion. And since we're marking World Press Freedom Day, it would be very interesting to hear from you how all of this sort of links together in the context of media freedom. Platforms are using AI for content moderation, for content curation. What is the impact of all of this on journalism or on media pluralism? And what should or is being done? I know it's a very big question, but you have the easy task of responding to it. Thanks, Arzu.
Thank you for having me on this panel. And you know, it's unfortunate that the news I'm bringing are not good. I mean, there's nothing, the impact has been really quite significant, and it's based on my personal experience having to work with platforms and experiences of other journalist colleagues who've dealt with platforms, and specifically with the way AI is actually used by the platforms and has an impact on their work. So no good news there, but I'll try not to be as pessimistic, although you'll be the judge of that as our panel moderator. You know, when I was trying to put together my notes for this panel, I came up with this alternative word to use for AI, and that's instead of calling it artificial intelligence, we should call it artificial intelligence. Especially in the context of media freedom and how platform and the use of AI on these platforms impacts media freedom and plurality. I think the most common issue I've witnessed and heard from others is that companies as a whole in general and the platforms, they really lack understanding of local contexts and local nuances and local languages. And as a result, because they lack this very significant knowledge, the AI that's deployed by them, by these platforms, is simply lacking all these nuances. And so the decision making that's done by this AI is completely is dismissive of these very important facts. And of course, the challenge is exacerbated by the fact that the code isn't open for scrutiny to civil society, to journalists as such. And frankly speaking, part of me, even though on one hand, I would like to be part of a community who does eventually get access, if there ever be a time like that, I'm also quite conscious of the fact that it should also not be our job as civil society, more broadly speaking, to invest our time, our resources, which are limited as is, into trying to improve whatever the mess that they've made, you know, simply putting it that way. And it's not the only issue here. You know, we're talking about accessibility of users to real staff at these platforms. Automated responses are often one of the challenges that journalists and news outlets face when they're trying to communicate with these platforms, because of, you know, the decisions that they're making that lack transparency and have no additional sort of feedback mechanism that is available to the users who are affected by this technology. You know, one common argument that I hear is that because AI is shielded from external review, you know, negating the principles of transparency and accountability, it's this the argument that used by companies is that, well, it's not let's just blame it all on AI because it's responsible for all the mistakes that are made. And yet you know, they're forgetting the fact that they're the ones who wrote this code, so they are essentially responsible for all the mistakes. So just blaming everything on AI is quite remarkable. I actually read a very interesting pointer. I think it was published by the Poynter Institute, that actually talks about how companies like Google, Twitter, and Facebook blamed the algorithm in a very specific case back in 2017. And yeah, they make exactly this point that, you know, you can't just hide behind blaming the algorithm. It is up to you to make it work better and make sure that it recognizes all these nuances. I also like to note this report that was published by the Electronic Frontier Foundations that actually talks about the algorithm not being open. And it says that civil society and governments have been denied access to the training data or basic assumptions driving the algorithms. And there has never been any sort of third-party audit of such technology. And so as users of these platforms, who often have to deal with takedown requests or blocked content, we don't even know what kind of data these algorithms are fed and based on what these decisions are being made. So it is biased approach also because of the languages in which this technology is deployed, because more often than not, it's like English. I'm yet to hear that there are examples in Azerbaijani or Turkish or any other languages that are not dominant languages. And I want to give a few other examples from the journalist community that I've heard where AI has been really having an impact on the work that they do. And just to clarify all the points that I made, there's a YouTube. I'm not going to name any countries or the names of the platforms just for the sake of clarity. So one example I wanted to share with you was a YouTube channel of a local media that was taken down by the platform because of a false report by a third party that the video contained pornographic content. The director of the news platform failed to plead his case. And not only did YouTube not agree to hear the case, its response have been all automated. And just to be clear, there was no pornographic content. The content that was published by the YouTube channel was political content and critical of the government decisions that were being covered by this media outlet. Another local media outlet with several YouTube channels struggled to keep its video channels open on the platform because according to a local media director from this platform, there was a partner on the ground in the country of YouTube that was making these false reports to YouTube that all of these YouTube channels were actually producing false information or that they were violating the community guidelines. And the director of the media platform, once again, had a really hard time pleading his case with the platform because no one simply understood the language of the video content that was being reported. And he failed to find an actual person to communicate with at the platform. I've also come across instances where media platforms have been sanctioned due to mentioning of names of individuals or organizations that are labeled by companies like Facebook or Meta now as dangerous, i.e. the dangerous individuals and organizations list. There are thousands of names on that list. And when a local news platform reports on a story that mentions one of those names on that list, it's flagged by the platform and is often taken down or shut down, even though they have nothing to do with the said list, the dangerous individuals and organizations list. This shows that the so-called intelligence technology deployed fails to differentiate between objective reporting and actual propaganda. And there's also the matter of, I call it fame and popularity. Perhaps that's not the right terminology to use, but the reason I'm saying it is because the chances of pleading your case if you are with a much larger media institution, a media establishment, or if you're a well-known individual journalist, it's much easier to get someone at either of those platforms to respond to your case when you get taken down or your channel is shut down or there is some other issue. This is not the case for smaller local media platforms that don't have these connections, or for a freelance journalist, for instance, who does not have these connections. And so as a result, and especially in political contexts where there is censorship of the media and where censored media relies heavily on the use of social media platforms for news gathering, for sharing news, for documentation of rights violations and whatnot, they get kicked off from these platforms as a result of biased AI and its decision making. And so they get double censored. Not only are they censored by their local governments, but they're also get censored by these big platforms. And still it doesn't end there. You know, there's also lack of action and often a refusal to take down content that is actually posing a threat to the journalists themselves. This was one example that I've heard from a colleague of mine when they informed Facebook that their journalists were being doxxed on their platform. Facebook refused to remove the content because it was in a different language. And it also said, it cited as evidence that the content didn't violate their community standards. And, you know, had the automated decision been made by an individual who was familiar with the language, with the political context, with the media itself, with the media platform itself, perhaps that content would have been taken down because it was a clear example of doxing, and yet the content remained. There are also more and more examples of inability to communicate with real individuals, something that I mentioned earlier already at these companies, especially when AI makes these decisions on their behalf, regardless of who you are. So often especially the smaller you are as a media organization or as a freelance journalist, for instance, if you're not well known, you basically end up relying on third-party organizations who do have an interaction with these platforms, who can argue on your behalf, which also in and of itself is, you know, so much, we're talking about so much time that goes into pleading your case with a third party, trying to get them act on your behalf. And I will give you just one last example I've come across. So there's a journalist from a certain country who has multiple social media accounts. He does investigative journalist. He also has this satirical channel where he talks about the issues, the persisting issues in the country, but he does it from a humoristic perspective, sort of trying to get people's attention. The authorities had access to his national ID. And so they actually had Meta shut down all of his accounts, claiming that they were the actual owner of the accounts rather than he was, using his official ID. And when he tried to plead his case, all he got was an automated response. And so in his case, he once again had to rely on third-party organizations to actually intervene on his behalf and restore. And we're still working on that case, actually. We haven't been able to fully restore access to all of his accounts. So, you know, language, decision-making, and I think this arbitrariness of decision-making by the platforms is also like one of the things that really is concerning to me, and also speaking to journalists who experience this over and over again. It's been really mind-boggling not to see better solutions offered to journalists who struggle with these platforms, but who also rely on them to actually get hold of information, to share information and whatnot. And finally, I think, you know, somewhere along the way, the platforms forget that they really must respect international human rights standards and that fundamental rights and freedoms of users must be at the core of their regulations and their platforms. And, you know, I think, you know, we've all seen Facebook papers, you know, unfortunately, to whistleblowers and extensive list of documents known as Facebook papers later, there's still no guarantees for transparency and accountability on platforms that are used by civil society users worldwide, and especially in countries where these platforms are the only lifeline for documenting human rights abuses, publishing news, and calling for accountability and transparency.
Thank you very much, Arzu, particularly for these concrete examples. I think it helps really, helps us understand better the individual and societal impact that this has. It's not just sort of hypothetical or theoretical issues we're talking about here, but they have real impact. And particularly what struck me is exactly this issue and all previous panelists have also sort of touched upon it, is this notion that we had this sort of really positive, exciting moment in the past of the internet being this space that brings about positive change for increased dialogue. And I don't want to end on a negative point. I certainly don't want to indicate that the internet is now simply a horrible place that should be shut down. That is not the direction we're going or suggesting. But the point that you exactly make, that when governments are shutting down dissidents, that these platforms and the internet as a space was kind of like a refuge space, which is now no longer an obvious space as such. So you have this, what you call double censorship, as a challenge that we need to also confront. But just hearing all of the, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left. So I'm just gonna sort of briefly wrap up. And if there's any final remarks that anyone would like to make based on that, I think we're probably leaving this discussion with more questions than answers, which is natural at this point in time where we find ourselves on all of these issues. But like many of you have already said, we have this issue, particularly when we talk about content. The more outrageous the content, the more harmful, the more likely it ends up spreading online, right? This is the issue we have about when we talk about the amplification of disinformation through these technologies. And we know that also this type of harmful content can spread in a very personalized way, as Susie mentioned, and the manipulation factor there and how that impacts freedom of opinion. And how do we address that? And Vladan, you mentioned that, one of the biggest challenges and concerns we've had for years is that we just don't know. And we still don't really know what's going on behind these algorithms, AI systems, data sets. But you rightfully said, even if we see all of the algorithms and the AI systems and so on, we'll never really be able to measure all of the consequences because of the scale, but also because the machinery is not fine-tuned for public interest, but like you said, for profit. And linking that to what was also said by many of you is this sort of notion that, or the response by platforms often is that, let's blame it on the algorithms or on the technology, forgetting that there are humans behind that technology, decision makers, engineers developing it, executives deploying and utilizing it. So there is a possibility for change. And I'd like to sort of end on that notion that I think it's not impossible, that there is a way. And I think the biggest question there is sort of, like Arzu said, it's not our responsibility as users to fix the mess that has been made, in your words, but who should be responsible and what should such responsibility look like? Is I think the question that I would love to have more time to debate, but perhaps at another time. And I think that's an important question that I'd like to leave with all of you to think about, and perhaps also visit the policy manual that the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media mentioned, which also addresses and answers some of those questions as well. But with that, I'd also like to remind everyone that we have this fantastic cartoonist, Bex, who was with us, and who's been sketching for us. I have to admit that I cannot see him on the screen, but I hope that the people in the room and the people joining us virtually. Hi, Bex. Oh, we do see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm very excited to see the final illustration that you have for our session. And finally, thank you, especially to all of you, Vladan, Arzu, Susie, and Ms. Teresa Rivero for hosting this session, and UNESCO for actually hosting the entire World Press Freedom Day and allowing us to have this discussion within it. So thank you all very much.
And thanks to you also to the people in the room. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions because you can see us, but we do have several people here in the room. So unfortunately, we will have to end on the big questions that we have kind of posed to ourselves in the session. But you can also see and visit the visuals by Bex here in the room in the background. And we also heard it will be exhibited throughout the next days here at World Press Freedom Day conference. So thanks also from my side and also to the speakers, of course, and Denise.